Right, so what we have here is a very quick video to talk all about Dora. Will that ever get old? No, because it's hilarious. So what is Dora? Well, it's the Defence of the Realm Act, and it's an attempt by the British government to get involved in controlling the lives of its people to make sure it wins the war effort. But what does that look like? Well, one of the things is press censorship. Wait, that's better. Press censorship basically forbid the newspapers from publishing things that might fall into the enemy hands, which could give away British positions. So the newspapers weren't allowed to write anything that might give the enemy a hint as to what's going on. So for example, military positions in France, that's forbidden. Because again, if the enemy get hold of that, they might use it against the British. So what the government decides is we must make that illegal. And they do. And actually, not just illegal, but a capital offence. Someone could actually be executed if they found out to have done exactly this. In actual fact, 10 people are killed under this law. 10 people. Thousands. But it's not just newspaper reports that get censored. Even letters home from the front line were also censored. So people would read them before they got given to the families, just to make sure that nothing in there was said to be too bad, to make people's morale drop and go, oh man, I wish we weren't fighting this war. And also to make sure that no sensitive, secret information that might be used to help the enemy was included either. So the Defence of the Realm Act was the government's way to control the media, to make sure that only positive things were being said about the war, to make sure that people stayed happy and pro-war and not boo war. That was really important for the government, because if people are happy about the war, they will continue to work hard and support the war effort. So what else did Dora allow the government to control? Well, in terms of industry, quite a bit. The government was allowed in the D.O.R.A Act to take over the mines in the country. That was important because the government needed to make sure that enough coal was being produced to go into the factories to make the weapons. So controlling the mines was really important. Next up was railways. Railways are really important because they need to make sure they can move the coal from the mines to the factories. They don't need any delays or anything like that in the way. So they thought, how can we best ensure that happens? Let's take over the railways ourselves. So they take over the railways. And guess what else they took over? You've guessed it, shipping. Now shipping is also really important because we're getting a lot of our food from the empire. And so we need to make sure that food's coming in. So the government decides we'll take over the shipping companies and ensure that food comes in. Now with these businesses that they're taking over, they realise that some business owners are going to be a little bit annoyed that they've just lost their companies. So what they decide to do is they agree with the business owners that they will continue to pay the business owners the same profits they received from the previous year every year that the war goes on. So in 1914 or 1915, in 1915 these companies will receive the same profits they earned from 1914 because the government will just pay it to them. That makes sense, I think you'll agree. But there's a crisis on the horizon, and that crisis comes in the form of the Munitions Crisis. Now this comes out because the Daily Mail publishes a story which exposes this huge problem that the British Army have. There's not enough munitions. Now that's a really big problem because World War I is trench warfare, which basically works like this. If the British are in the trench, they want to get to the trench of the enemy. Now to do that, they have these big artillery things over here. Now the artillery fires explosive shells at the enemy. The idea being is that they fire enough of those shells and hopefully a lot of the enemy will die. A bit like this. The idea then being, our British soldier could then go across and capture that trench. But what if there's not enough shells flying from the artillery into the German lines? Well, when the British troops come out their trench, they could be met with machine gun fire from abnormally large Germans. That would mean that, obviously, we start to lose a lot of British lives. So it's really, really important that we keep the munitions flowing into France so that our artillery can continue to bombard the German positions. So if there is a shortage of artillery, it could actually lead to the loss of British lives. So when the Daily Mail exposed a scandal that actually we're running very short on our ammunition, then that's a big, big problem for the British government. So much so that the British government realises we've got a crisis on our hands. So what do? Well, one thing, they do this. We get a coalition government. So the Liberal government that was in charge of the country say to the Conservatives, we need some help doing this war thing, do you mind giving us a hand? And they team up. So we have the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party working together, which is really good. Particularly so because they decide that they need someone in charge of munitions. There needs to be a special minister for that role. And do you know who gets the job? Our favourite David Lloyd George. I sense I'm more excited about that than you are. David Lloyd George is actually a bit of a legend when it comes to this role, because what he decides to do is he needs to make sure that we've got enough factories online. So he creates government-owned factories that are going to produce munitions. Not just that, he realises, well, we need people to run them, we need people to actually make munitions inside the factories. I'd better hire some of those women who keep telling me that they want to take part in this war effort. So the government hires a lot of women to go into the factories to help out with the munitions building, which they do. Now you might be thinking, whoa, how do the men feel about the women coming in and taking the jobs? In particular, how do the trade unions feel? Well, clever you, you're right to be concerned. The trade unions aren't thrilled about the prospect of women coming into the jobs that used to be run by men. Why? Well, actually, the reason why is because they're afraid that if the women come into the jobs and do a pretty good job, but at a lower wage, then after the war, the employers might look at women and go, do you know what? You're pretty good at this and you're cheap. We'll just keep you on and forget the men. So the trade unions, whose members were men, were very worried about that. So David Lloyd George has to promise them that don't worry, two things are going to happen. Firstly, women will be paid the same as the men, so don't worry about that. Secondly, we'll make sure that the men take back the jobs once the war is over. So don't worry, trade unions. And they come to some sort of agreement. The other problem we have is that with lots of factories around making munitions, there's a lot of demand for skilled workers. And so skilled workers are thinking, hang about, there's lots of factories and factory owners that want me. I bet I can get a better pay somewhere else. And so what we start to see is people moving around to try and get the best pay. That's a problem for the government because it needs everyone to be staying in the same place to get the job done. And so David Lloyd George and the government decide, right, we're going to ban people from moving around and getting better paid jobs. You're going to have to stay put, I'm afraid. Who's not going to like that? It's those trade unions again, of course. So what are they going to do? Well, what does a trade union do when it's not happy? Strike! And boy, do they like a good strike. In 1916, 235,000 workers across the year at some point go on strike. 1918, that's up to 900,000. And why is that a problem for the government? Well, they're not in the factories making things, they're not helping the war effort. And so we're losing all this potential production because people are out there striking. So, you're a German military leader and you're at war with an island. What's its Achilles heel? What is Britain's weakness that the Germans might be able to exploit? It's an island, where's it getting its food from? Now the government knew this right from the get-go. So as part of D.O.R.A, what they decide is, we'll give ourselves the right just to confiscate land. Ooh, that way, please. And what they do is they take over that little bit of land and they make it sure that it's just growing crops. Because this country, we need to make sure we're feeding ourselves. But unfortunately, we can't do it all by ourselves. We need to get food from elsewhere. Now at this time, Britain has a pretty big empire. So what we do is we start importing food from all over the empire. Now, you're a German leader, you look at that and you think, what can we do about this? We can deploy our U-boats, our submarines, and destroy the food before it gets into Britain. What a cunning plan you've got there. So what we start to see is British ships being targeted by German U-boats, their submarines. And it gets pretty intense in 1917. In fact, by April 1917, 1 in 4 British ships carrying supplies is sunk by the German Navy. 1 in 4, 25%. That's incredible. And that worries the British government. In fact, at one point, we are down to just 6 weeks worth of wheat left to keep our country ticking over. 6 weeks. That is a crisis. So if there's a shortage of something, what happens to its price? It goes up. And actually it gets to the point where rich people start to realise, hang on, there's a shortage, we better buy as much of this as we can and we'll hoard it, we'll keep it to ourselves. So poorer people start to struggle to buy things like bread. Now the government knows this and thinks, how are we going to deal with this? So they come up with a plan. rationing, or at least voluntary rationing. So they asked the royal family to lead this initiative, and lead it they do. They announced that they're going to cut back on the amount of wheat they eat in bread and things, to try and be the example to the rest of the country. We can do it, why can't you? And of course the British people look at the royal family and go, nah, I like my bread too much, to be honest. And so it doesn't really work. So by January 1918, the government realised we've got to do something. Let's force rationing on people. What that means is when people go to get their sugar, their meat and their beer, they have to have a ration book with them, and it comes with stamps. You cannot buy meat, sugar, beer without these stamps. So what it means is that everyone has got an equal opportunity to buy these food. This works well, and everyone has an opportunity therefore to get hold of these things which they need. So they're the main things that D.O.R.A kind of does to make sure that Britain runs smoothly during this war effort. But what about the extra little things that the government does to make sure that Britain's safe? Well, they do a few things here. First of all, they make sure that people don't fly kites. Flying kites is banned. Starting a bonfire, banned. The worry is that if you light a fire or fly a kite, a Zeppelin might see that happening, and go, ooh, we'll aim for there, we'll bomb there because there's people there. So that's all banned. What else do they do? Well, they also ban the feeding of animals with bread. Particularly after 1917 when we're running short on bread. It kind of makes sense. So going to the park and feeding the ducks with bread? No. And the government outlaws that too. But how do we stop people from getting drunk? Now the worry here is that we need our workers to be extremely productive. If they're going off and getting drunk, that's probably going to lead to a hangover in the morning. And if you're hungover, so I hear, you're not as productive as you could be. So the government decides we need to do something here. So they do a couple of things. First of all, they make sure beer is watered down. It's not going to be as strong as it was before. So you have to really try quite hard to get drunk. The second thing they do is they limit the opening hours of pubs. So pubs cannot open now between 3:30 PM and 6:30 PM. And they've got to close by 9:30 PM. By breaking up the day, people can't just drink their way all the way through the day. They have to go and find something else to do. Hang out with their family or something. So by breaking that up, it means people can't go on these very long binges and get drunk. And therefore, they'll be more productive when they're in the factories. So you can see D.O.R.A is a really important act because it gives the government this ridiculous amount of control over people's lives. And it's really, really important. In fact, the government knew it was important when they came up with this idea, but they didn't have a debate about it. There was no discussion in Parliament about the pros and cons of this act, unlike usual laws where there's lots and lots of discussion. They just thought, do you know what, we need to give ourselves lots of power. Any problems? No, great, let's sign this one through. And they agreed the law, and it goes immediately into effect. So D.O.R.A is actually a very important law for our topic.